The Fall of the Iron Curtain, 1980–1991. Empires don't collapse in explosions. They crumble in silence. The 1980s began with the world still divided. Two superpowers staring each other down across oceans, walls, and ideologies. But the ground beneath both of them was shifting. Technology, economics, and human will were about to do what no army ever could: bring the Cold War to an end. It wouldn't happen in one battle. It would happen in boardrooms, living rooms, and broadcast screens, one realization at a time, that neither side could win a war that would destroy them both. 1. The Reagan era, a new confrontation. In 1981, Ronald Reagan entered the White House with a simple promise: we win, they lose. Reagan saw the Soviet Union not as a rival to contain, but an empire to defeat. He called it the evil empire. His message was clear: America would no longer just defend. It would outspend, outsmart, and outlast. Reagan poured billions into rebuilding the U.S. military: new bombers, submarines, missiles, and the controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, known as Star Wars. It proposed space-based lasers that could shoot down incoming nuclear missiles. While many scientists doubted its feasibility, it terrified the Soviet leadership. The U.S. economy was booming. The USSR's was breaking. The arms race was becoming an economic war, one the Soviets could not afford. 2. The wall that divided the world in Europe. The symbol of the Cold War still stood tall: the Berlin Wall. Built in 1961, it was concrete proof of a divided world, a scar through the heart of a city, separating families, lovers, and dreams. Each year, East Germans risked their lives trying to cross it. Guards shot anyone who tried. To the west, the wall was tyranny. To the east, it was protection from Western corruption. But for the people trapped behind it, it was a prison. Throughout the 1980s, American presidents stood before the wall, vowing it would one day fall. And in 1987, Reagan spoke the words that would echo through history: "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." At the time, few believed it could happen, but change was already coming, from within the Soviet Union itself. 3. Gorbachev's revolution in 1985. After years of stagnation and failed leaders, a younger man took power in Moscow: Mikhail Gorbachev. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev was not hardened by war. He was shaped by crisis. The Soviet economy was collapsing. The people were restless. The empire was crumbling from the inside. Gorbachev understood something no Soviet leader had dared admit: the USSR could not keep competing with America indefinitely. He launched two bold reforms: perestroika, restructuring the economy, allowing limited capitalism and private business; glasnost, openness, granting freedom of speech, loosening censorship, and exposing decades of corruption. It was revolutionary. But it was also dangerous. For the first time, citizens could question their government, and once they started, they didn't stop. 4. The shifting world across Eastern Europe. Gorbachev's reforms sent shockwaves. In Poland, the labor union Solidarity, led by Lech Wałęsa, demanded democratic rights and won them. In Hungary, borders opened. In Czechoslovakia, students filled the streets chanting for freedom. The Iron Curtain was rusting, and it couldn't hold much longer. Meanwhile, the US and the USSR began signing historic agreements. INF Treaty, 1987, eliminating entire classes of nuclear missiles. It was the first real step backward in the arms race. The Cold War wasn't over yet, but its foundations were cracking. 5. The Information Revolution. The 1980s progressed. A new force began reshaping the world: information. Computers, satellites, and television eroded the barriers of propaganda. For decades, the Soviet regime had controlled every word printed and every image shown. Now, through Western media, its people saw what they were missing: freedom, wealth, and choice. The truth became the most dangerous weapon of all. No wall could stop a signal. No censorship could hide reality forever. By the late 1980s, the battle for minds was over. Communism was losing, not to bombs but to ideas. 6. The Soviet Vietnam in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was bleeding. For nearly a decade, it had fought a war it couldn't win. American-backed Mujahideen fighters, armed with Stinger missiles, turned Soviet helicopters into fireballs across the mountains. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers died. At home, mothers buried their sons in silence. The war became a symbol of futility, proof that the empire was dying from within. By 1989, Gorbachev ordered a full withdrawal. It was a moment of truth. The USSR could no longer project power. The last Soviet tank left Afghanistan, and with it, the myth of invincibility. Then, 1989, the year the walls fell. Change, once unthinkable, now became unstoppable. In 1989, across Eastern Europe, communist regimes began collapsing one by one, not through invasion, but through revolution. Poland elected its first non-communist government. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to escape to the west. Mass protests erupted in Prague and Leipzig. And then, on November 9, 1989, it happened. East Germany announced citizens could cross freely. Crowds surged to the Berlin Wall, climbing it, hammering it, tearing it apart piece by piece. Television cameras captured history in real time, soldiers embracing civilians, families reuniting, strangers crying together. The wall didn't just fall, an entire era ended. 8. The fall of the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was no going back. Across the Soviet republics, in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, people demanded independence. Gorbachev tried to hold the Union together, but the tide of history was unstoppable. In 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup to overthrow him. It failed, and in its failure, the Soviet Union itself died. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the world for the last time. He announced his resignation and declared that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics no longer existed. That night, the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin. In its place rose the flag of the Russian Federation. The Cold War, after 46 years of fear, rivalry and shadow conflict, was over. The world after the war, when the dust settled. America stood as the sole superpower. The Western world celebrated the triumph of democracy and capitalism. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the world had entered an age of peace, but the scars remained. The Cold War had cost trillions of dollars, millions of lives, and decades of anxiety. Nations had been reshaped, governments overthrown, and generations raised in fear. The nuclear weapons still existed. The ideologies still echoed. And while the Iron Curtain had fallen, new divisions of power, technology, and influence would soon rise. 10. Legacy of the Cold War today. The Cold War is gone, but its fingerprints remain everywhere. In the global military alliances, NATO still stands. In the nuclear arsenals that remain on alert. In the rivalries of space, technology, and propaganda that have simply evolved into new forms. But perhaps the greatest legacy is psychological. For nearly half a century, humanity lived under the shadow of annihilation and somehow survived. We learned that power without understanding leads to ruin, and that peace, however fragile, is worth every effort. The end of the Cold War. The Cold War didn't end in victory. It ended in exhaustion. Two giants, built on fear and pride, finally realized that their greatest enemy wasn't each other. It was their own ambition. The missiles stayed silent, the bombs never fell, and the world, for all its madness, got another chance. From the ashes of Hiroshima to the fall of the Berlin Wall, from whispered espionage to the roar of rockets, The Cold War told one timeless story, that survival is the ultimate victory. Epilogue. A world still cold. Today, the world remembers the Cold War as history, but history has a way of repeating itself. The weapons have changed, the fears have not. The lesson remains the same. Peace isn't given by power. It's earned by understanding. The Silent Battlefield, 1963-1980. The bombs were silent, but the world was still at war. The year is 1963. The missiles have left Cuba. The world has stepped back from the edge. But peace is an illusion. The Cold War hasn't ended. It's simply gone underground. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of the Middle East, the superpowers will clash again, through allies, propaganda, and spies. The battle is no longer about land. It's about influence, technology, and survival. 1. Vietnam. America's quagmire. In the heart of Southeast Asia, a small country became the world's most painful battlefield. Vietnam, divided after World War II into the Communist North and the US-backed South, became the ultimate proxy war. To Washington, stopping communism in Vietnam was essential. If one nation falls, they said, others will follow. By 1965, the United States had over 180,000 troops in the country. By 1969, that number had climbed to 500,000. But this wasn't a conventional war. The Viet Cong didn't fight on open fields. They struck from jungles, tunnels, and villages. The enemy was invisible and the cost was unbearable. Helicopters burned. Cities crumbled. Villages were caught between sides. Television brought the war into American homes. Every death, every bomb, every protest. For the first time, the American public could see the horror of their own foreign policy. The government called it a war for freedom. The people began calling it a mistake. By 1975, Saigon fell. The United States had lost 58,000 soldiers, billions of dollars, and, more importantly, its moral certainty. The most powerful nation on earth had failed to defeat a smaller, poorer country. For the Soviet Union, it was a symbolic victory. For America, it was a scar that would shape its politics for decades. 2. The golden age of espionage. While soldiers fought in the jungles, spies fought in silence. The 1960s and 1970s became the golden age of espionage. Every embassy was a battlefield, every diplomat a potential informant. The CIA orchestrated coups and covert operations from Latin America to the Middle East. The KGB infiltrated Western governments, universities, and even cultural institutions. One of the most infamous cases was Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who secretly sold intelligence to the Soviets for years, leading to the deaths of American agents. In return, the US recruited defectors from Moscow, men who revealed the deep paranoia and brutality of the Soviet regime. Meanwhile, entire cities like Berlin, Vienna, and Istanbul became spy capitals of the world. In smoky bars and dim alleys, microfilms changed hands, briefcases were switched, and lies became currency. The Cold War was now a theater of deception, every secret a potential weapon. 3. Space, the new high ground. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides realized space was more than prestige, it was power. Satellites could spy, communicate, and guide missiles. Whoever controlled orbit would control Earth. The 1960s became a cosmic duel. In 1961, the Soviets launched Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. But in 1969, America struck back with history's defining moment, Apollo 11. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, the world gasped. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But beneath the inspiration lay military ambition. Every rocket that carried astronauts could also carry nuclear warheads. Space had become the ultimate battlefield, vast, silent, and beyond any border. By the 1970s, spy satellites could read license plates from orbit. Space wasn't science fiction anymore, it was strategy. 4. The Third World becomes the front line. the Cold War spread far beyond Europe. In Africa, newly independent nations became ideological battlegrounds. In Angola, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, the Soviets armed revolutionaries while the US backed rival factions. In Latin America, Washington launched operations to prevent another Cuba. In 1973, the CIA supported a coup in Chile, overthrowing the elected socialist president Salvador Allende and installing General Augusto Pinochet. To many, America had abandoned democracy to fight communism. In the Middle East, superpower rivalry fueled endless instability. When Egypt turned to the US after years of Soviet alignment, the balance shifted again. Oil, religion, and ideology intertwined. The Cold War had become truly global. 5. The nuclear mirage. By the mid-1970s, the world had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy itself dozens of times. To manage the madness, Washington and Moscow began negotiating arms control agreements. The first major breakthrough came with SALT Wine, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, in 1972. It didn't end the arms race, but it slowed it. Both sides agreed to limit nuclear launches and create direct communication links. It was also the era of détente, a temporary easing of tensions. President Richard Nixon's visit to Moscow, and even to communist China, stunned the world. For a moment it seemed humanity might learn to coexist, but peace built on fear is fragile. The treaties didn't stop both sides from continuing to build deadlier, faster weapons. Multiple warhead missiles, stealth bombers, and nuclear submarines. Each advance only deepened the paradox. The more weapons they built, the less likely they were to use them. 6. The age of technology and control beyond missiles. Technology became the new frontier. Computers entered military planning rooms. Early satellites formed global surveillance networks. Encryption, code-breaking, and cyber tactics began long before the Internet. The U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, expanded rapidly, monitoring radio waves, telephone calls, and satellite signals across continents. The Soviets developed vast listening stations in Eastern Europe and Cuba. Every word mattered. Every whisper could change the balance of power. This was the dawn of information warfare, long before the term existed. 7. Life behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet bloc. The facade of unity hid cracks. East Germany, Poland, and Hungary lived under constant surveillance. Secret police, the Stasi, the KGB, the Securitate, monitored every phone call, every gathering, every joke. Yet beneath the fear, people dreamed of freedom. Western radio stations like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe broadcast rock music, uncensored news, and the taste of liberty across the border. In America, life was prosperous. Malls, cars, color television, but beneath the comfort was the shadow of anxiety. Children practiced nuclear drills. Cities built fallout shelters. Every siren could mean the end. Both societies lived under fear, one from censorship, the other from annihilation. 8. Afghanistan. The last frontier of the 1970s, in 1979, a revolution in Afghanistan brought a communist government to power. The Soviets feared instability on their southern border, and in December they invaded. To the world, it looked like just another regional war. But for the United States, it was a line that couldn't be crossed. Through the CIA's Operation Cyclone, America began secretly funding and arming Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen, supplying them with weapons, training, and intelligence. The war was brutal. Mountains turned into graveyards. Villages burned. And once again, two superpowers were fighting indirectly, each using others as their pawns. It would be the USSR's Vietnam, a long, costly quagmire that bled them from within. 9. The Cold. Within by the end of the 1970s, both superpowers were exhausted. The US was recovering from Watergate, inflation, and the loss of public trust. The Soviet Union was drowning in bureaucracy, corruption, and a stagnant economy, but neither side could admit weakness. They smiled for the cameras, shook hands at summits, and kept building weapons in secret. The peace was fragile, an illusion stretched thin over mutual suspicion. The edge of change. As the decade closed, both societies were about to face change they couldn't control. A new generation was rising, one that had never seen World War II, that questioned old ideologies, that wanted freedom, culture, and truth. And in the midst of global fatigue, a quiet revolution was forming, not through weapons, but through ideas. The 1980s would bring a new kind of leader, a new kind of confrontation, and a new chance to end the greatest standoff in history. The Cold War's deadliest battles weren't fought with bombs or tanks, but with secrets, lies, and whispers. From Vietnam's jungles to Berlin's walls, from the space above to the shadows below, the world became a silent battlefield. And as the 1980s dawned, both America and the Soviet Union faced a new question. Could this war of fear finally end, or would it consume them both? The Brink of Doom, 1961-1962. For 13 days, the fate of humanity hung by a thread. By the dawn of the 1960s, the world had become a powder keg, and both superpowers were holding matches. America was the land of prosperity, but also paranoia. The Soviet Union was ambitious, determined to prove its equality with the West. And in the middle of it all lay a small island, Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Here, the Cold War would turn from a battle of words into a confrontation that nearly erased humanity from existence. The spark in Havana in 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's US-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. At first, America watched cautiously. Castro was young, charismatic, and promised reform. But soon, his government began nationalizing American-owned businesses and aligning with the Soviet Union. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower cut off diplomatic ties, the U.S. secretly plotted his removal. By 1961, under the new President John F. Kennedy, a covert invasion plan called the Bay of Pigs was launched. Cuban exiles trained by the CIA attempted to overthrow Castro. It was a disaster. Within 3 days, the invasion collapsed. Castro's forces crushed the attackers. To the world, the U.S. looked humiliated. To the Soviets, this was an opportunity. Khrushchev's gamble. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev saw a chance to shift the balance of power. At that time, America had nuclear missiles stationed across Europe and Turkey, aimed directly at Moscow. But the Soviet Union had none near U.S. territory. The solution: secretly deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. By 1962, Soviet ships began carrying nuclear warheads, launch equipment, and thousands of troops to the island, all under the guise of defensive aid. The plan was bold, dangerous, and potentially world-ending. When finished, these missiles could strike Washington, New York, and almost every major U.S. city within minutes. The discovery in October 1962, a U.S. U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba took a series of high-altitude photographs. When the images were analyzed, they revealed something horrifying: Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction. President Kennedy was briefed on the morning of October 16th. For the next 13 days, the world would live on the edge of annihilation. Kennedy convened his closest advisors, forming the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM. Inside the White House, voices clashed. Some urged an immediate airstrike, to bomb the sites before they became operational. Others warned that such an attack would almost certainly trigger nuclear retaliation. There was no playbook for this, only judgment and the hope it was right. The naval blockade. Kennedy made his decision. Instead of attacking, he ordered a naval quarantine, a blockade around Cuba to stop further Soviet shipments. On October 22, 1962, He addressed the nation on live television. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. The message was clear. The United States would not tolerate nuclear weapons in Cuba. The Navy prepared for confrontation. Soviet ships were already approaching the quarantine line. Any miscalculation could start the last war humanity would ever fight. 5. The world holds its breath across the planet. People waited. In New York, citizens lined up to buy canned food. In Moscow, families tuned in to hear Khrushchev's defiant speeches. Every television, every newspaper, every conversation centered on one question: would the world survive the week? At the height of the crisis, U.S. forces moved to DEFCON 2, one step away from full-scale nuclear war. Bombers were armed. Submarines were deployed. Soldiers at missile bases slept beside their weapons. For the first time, global extinction was not theoretical. It was a possibility measured in hours. 6. The spy who stopped Armageddon in Moscow. A quiet act of courage was unfolding. A Soviet double agent named Oleg Penkovsky had already been providing U.S. intelligence with secret documents, including details of Soviet missile capabilities. His warnings helped Kennedy understand that Khrushchev's nuclear forces were not as powerful as they seemed. This knowledge gave Kennedy confidence to hold the line, not to strike first, but not to back down either. Penkovsky was later caught, tried, and executed, but his intelligence likely helped prevent World War III. 7. The near misson. October 27, 1962, the most dangerous day of the Cold War. A U.S. U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. Many in Kennedy's inner circle demanded immediate retaliation. For hours, the president and his generals debated. A single airstrike could trigger a nuclear counterattack. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, a Soviet submarine armed with a nuclear torpedo was being hunted by U.S. destroyers dropping depth charges. Inside the submarine, communication with Moscow was lost. The captain believed war had already begun. He ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. Only one man, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to give his consent. His calm resistance stopped the launch and possibly saved the planet. 8. The deal. That same night, Khrushchev sent a secret message to Washington. He offered to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade the island. A second letter arrived the next day, more aggressive, demanding the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey as well. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and his brother Robert F. Kennedy devised a secret compromise. The U.S. would publicly accept the first offer and privately agree to remove its missiles from Turkey within months. The deal was accepted. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world had stepped back from the brink. 9. Aftermath. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed everything. Both leaders had stared into the abyss and survived. In its aftermath, the United States and Soviet Union established a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, a red phone to prevent miscommunication in future crises. Kennedy's image soared, seen as a calm, decisive leader who avoided disaster. Khrushchev, however, paid a political price. Many in the Kremlin saw his retreat as weakness. Within 2 years, he was removed from power, but both men understood something few politicians ever would, that in the nuclear age there are no true victories, only survival. 10. Lessons from the edge. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the closest humanity has ever come to self-destruction. It revealed how fear, pride, and miscommunication could nearly end civilization in less than 2 weeks. It also proved that dialogue, however tense, was humanity's last defense. Every minute of those 13 days carried the weight of extinction. Every decision a gamble between life and death. And as the world moved past the crisis, one question remained: would we ever learn from it or repeat it? 13 days. That's all it took for the fate of humanity to hang in balance. Not through hate, but through fear. Not through power, but through pride. The Cuban Missile Crisis didn't end the Cold War. It defined it. Because from that moment on, both America and the Soviet Union knew the next mistake could be their last. The race for power, 1950-1960. If peace was the goal, fear became the weapon. The year is 1950. The atomic age has begun, and the world has split into two armed camps, democracy and communism. Both the United States and the Soviet Union know one terrifying truth. Whoever controls the future of science and ideology will control the world. The Cold War has moved beyond politics. Now it's a race for power, for technology, for survival. 1. The Korean War cold turns hot in June 1950. North Korean troops, backed by the Soviet Union and later China, stormed across the 38th parallel into South Korea. It was the first real test of America's promise to contain communism. Within days, President Harry Truman ordered U.S. forces into battle under the United Nations flag. The war was brutal. Cities burned. Millions fled. Soldiers fought in freezing mountains and flooded rice fields. But this was more than a regional conflict. It was a proxy war, where America and the USSR tested each other's will, without ever officially declaring war. The United States dropped more bombs on Korea than it had on all of the Pacific during World War II. The Soviets armed and advised the North. China sent millions of troops, and when it finally ended in 1953, nothing had changed. The border stayed exactly where it started. But the world had changed forever. The Cold War had drawn blood. 2. The hydrogen bomb. If the atomic bomb was a monster, the hydrogen bomb was a god. In 1952, the United States detonated Ivy Mike, the first thermonuclear weapon, 450 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The explosion vaporized an island in the Pacific. The Soviets followed 1 year later with their own H-bomb test, RDS-6s. Now, each side had weapons that could not just destroy cities. They could annihilate entire continents. Military planners began calculating the unthinkable, acceptable losses in nuclear war. In these grim scenarios, tens of millions of deaths were treated like numbers on a page. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, was born. If one side launched, the other would retaliate, and both would die. Ironically, that very logic kept the peace. Fear became balance. Terror became stability. The propaganda war. The Cold War wasn't just fought with bombs, it was fought with ideas. In the 1950s, television became a weapon. America broadcast its dream life. Shiny cars, suburban homes, and endless freedom. Every sitcom and newsreel carried a message. Democracy meant prosperity. The Soviets countered with images of collective progress. Workers building massive dams, rockets soaring into the sky, statues of Lenin rising over cities. Each side promised paradise, but both were terrified of weakness. In Washington, McCarthyism continued to destroy careers. Artists, teachers, and even journalists were accused of being communist sympathizers. In Moscow, Stalin's paranoia reached a fever pitch. Thousands were purged for Western influence. Books were banned, speech censored, and neighbors spied on each other. The battle for hearts and minds was everywhere, from movie theaters to classrooms, from children's cartoons to Olympic Games. Even chess became political. 4. The invisible war of spies. While the public saw propaganda, the real war was fought in shadows. The CIA and KGB expanded their operations across the globe. Spies infiltrated embassies, sabotaged infrastructure, and stole classified technology. One of the most shocking cases was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, an American couple accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. They were executed in 1953, the only civilians in U.S. history to face the death penalty for espionage during peacetime. In Europe, Berlin became a nest of intrigue. every alley a potential meeting point, every diplomat a possible spy. In the skies, US U-2 reconnaissance planes flew over Soviet territory to photograph military bases. Each mission risked sparking World War III. The KGB countered with double agents like Kim Philby, a British intelligence officer secretly loyal to Moscow. The Cold War wasn't just global. It was personal, a war where a handshake could be a trap and a smile could mean death. 5. The science of survival. By the mid-1950s, both nations realized science would decide the future. America poured billions into laboratories, universities, and think tanks. This was the era of Rand Corporation, where strategists built models of nuclear conflict and predicted how humanity might end or survive. The Soviets, meanwhile, created a parallel network of scientific institutions focused on mathematics, rocketry, and physics. The goal wasn't just military power, it was prestige. Whoever controlled technology would control the narrative. In 1954, America launched the first nuclear-powered submarine, USS Nautilus, capable of staying underwater for months. In 1957, the Soviets struck back with the most shocking victory yet, Sputnik 1, the first satellite in space. For the first time, the world looked up and saw a red star moving across the night sky. Proof that the USSR could launch missiles across continents. The space race had begun, and the US was losing. 6. Panic in the sky. Sputnik triggered panic in Washington. Newspapers screamed headlines, "Reds beat US into space." School children practiced duck and cover drills, while the government rushed to create NASA in 1958. Science funding exploded. Math and physics became weapons of national defense. The race to space wasn't about exploration, it was about dominance. If the Soviets could send a satellite, they could send a nuclear warhead. Every beep of Sputnik's signal was a reminder that America was no longer untouchable. To catch up, the US launched Explorer 1, its own satellite, and started developing the ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. The sky had become the new battlefield. C7, the culture of fear. By the late 1950s, the Cold War wasn't just in government meetings. It was in the living room, the classroom, the cinema. Hollywood produced films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Day the Earth Stood Still, not so subtle metaphors for communist infiltration and nuclear paranoia. Suburban America lived a double life. Prosperity on the surface, panic underneath. Families built underground shelters, stocked with canned food, water, and Geiger counters. Magazines published survival guides, how to build your own fallout shelter. Children's books taught how to identify a mushroom cloud. For the first time, fear was normalized. The threat of nuclear annihilation was part of everyday conversation, a quiet, constant background noise to modern life. 8. The doomsday calculations. Deep within the Pentagon, military planners developed strategies with chilling names. Operation Dropshot, Massive Retaliation, Plan 5090. They created flowcharts of destruction. If the USSR struck first, America would respond with full force, and vice versa. But what if the warning systems failed? What if radar mistook a civilian plane for a missile? Several times, false alarms nearly triggered real launches. One wrong blip on a screen could have ended the world. And yet, both sides continued the build-up, not because they wanted war, but because they couldn't afford to look weak. 9. Khrushchev and the new face of the USSR. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The Soviet Union entered a period of uncertainty. Eventually, Nikita Khrushchev rose to power, a man both charismatic and unpredictable. He denounced Stalin's brutality, promised reform, and even visited the US in 1959, famously banging his shoe at the United Nations, shouting, "We will bury you." To Americans, this wasn't reform, it was a threat. Khrushchev wanted to show the world that communism could outperform capitalism, not through war, but through competition. Yet every act of peaceful rivalry carried the risk of escalation. 10. The world caught in between. While America and the USSR dominated headlines, other nations were caught in the middle. Europe rebuilt under NATO protection. Japan became a US ally. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, new nations emerged from colonialism, and both superpowers rushed to influence them. Each coup, revolution or uprising became a potential proxy war. If one side backed rebels, the other funded the government. The world had turned into a chessboard, and every pawn mattered. The 1950s ended not with peace, but with preparation. America had its missiles, its spies, its satellites. The Soviets had theirs. Both sides now stood face to face, staring across an invisible line, each finger hovering over the same red button. And as the new decade dawned, that button would almost be pressed. The beginning of shadows, 1945, 1950. The world had just escaped hell, but hell wasn't done with it yet. The Second World War ended in August 1945 with the atomic fire of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the first time in human history, one nation, the United States, held the power to erase civilization in a single afternoon. Cities that had stood for centuries turned to ash in seconds. To many Americans, the war was over. Peace had returned. But in the dark corridors of power in Washington and Moscow, a new conflict was already brewing. A war without battles, without borders, fought in the shadows of espionage, propaganda, and fear. This was the beginning of the Cold War. 1. A world-divided Europe was a ruin. Berlin was a skeleton of its former self. Millions were homeless. The Allies had won, but at an unthinkable cost. And now, two giants stood tall over the ashes, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had been allies in war, but ideological enemies in peace. America was the champion of capitalism and democracy. Its mission, to build a world where nations were free, markets open, and individuals could prosper. The Soviet Union was the torchbearer of communism, a system that rejected private ownership, embraced state control, and promised equality through collective power. At first, both sides pretended to coexist, but deep inside the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin believed the West would soon turn its guns on him. And in Washington, President Harry Truman was convinced the Soviets were plotting to spread their Red Revolution across the globe. Suspicion became the new currency of diplomacy. The Iron Curtain falls in May 1946. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited Missouri and uttered the words that would define an era. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain lay Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany, all now under Soviet influence. The United States saw this not as liberation, but as occupation. To contain Soviet power, Washington crafted a strategy called containment, the idea that communism must never be allowed to spread beyond its current borders. That doctrine would guide American foreign policy for the next half-century. 3. The nuclear monopoly. For a short moment, America believed it had an unbreakable advantage, the atomic bomb. No other nation had it. It was the ultimate weapon, a symbol of dominance. But what no one in Washington knew was that Moscow was closing in fast. Soviet scientists, aided by espionage rings inside the U.S. Manhattan Project, were already working on their own bomb. In 1949, to America's shock, the Soviets detonated First Lightning, their first nuclear test. The nuclear monopoly was over. Now both sides could erase each other from the map. Fear became the new superpower. 4. The Marshall Plan versus the Molotov Plan. As Europe struggled to recover, the U.S. unveiled the Marshall Plan in 1947, a massive aid program to rebuild war-torn nations and keep them aligned with the West. Billions of dollars flowed into France, Italy, and West Germany. Factories restarted. Cities came back to life. The Soviets saw it as a trap, a way for America to buy loyalty and extend its influence. In response, they created the Molotov Plan, binding Eastern European states into a Soviet-led economic bloc. Thus, the world split into two spheres, capitalist and communist, and between them grew a void of distrust and propaganda. 5. The birth of the CIA and the KGB. The new war was fought not with armies, but with secrets. In 1947, the United States created the Central Intelligence Agency, tasked with tracking Soviet operations and shaping covert foreign policy. The Soviets had their own answer, the KGB, a network of spies and informants that penetrated governments, scientific labs, and even Hollywood. Soon, the world was a chessboard of agents, double spies. Dead drops and coded messages passed in dark cafes. For every American asset in Moscow, there was a Soviet mole in Washington. The battlefield was invisible, but the stakes were nuclear. 6. Berlin. The first crisis. Berlin was the heart of the Cold War. The city was divided into 4 zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. But Berlin itself lay deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. In 1948, Stalin tried to push the West out by cutting off all roads and railways, a massive blockade. America responded not with bombs, but with airplanes. For nearly a year, cargo planes delivered food, coal, and medicine to the people of West Berlin in one of the greatest logistical operations in history, the Berlin Airlift. Every plane that landed was a message. We will not back down. Stalin blinked first. The blockade ended, but Berlin remained a powder keg that would explode again and again in the decades to come. 7. The Red Scare in America. Back in the United States, fear of communism spread like wildfire. The media warned of Soviet spies everywhere. Politicians called for loyalty tests. Teachers, actors, and scientists were accused of being traitors. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to fame by claiming he had a list of communists inside the government. It didn't matter that his evidence was thin. The fear was real. People lost their jobs, their reputations, and sometimes their lives. Freedom itself became a casualty of the Cold War mindset. 8. Technology as a weapon. While nations spied and argued, scientists built the future. America invested in long-range bombers, radar networks, and the early beginnings of computers for defense calculations. The Soviets poured resources into rocketry and missile development. Both believed the next war would be won not by soldiers, but by scientists. And they were right. Because by the 1950s, this technological race would leave Earth's atmosphere and move to the stars. But for now, the fear was terrestrial and very real. Every child in America learned to duck and cover. Every family built a bunker. For the first time, humankind lived under the shadow of its own destruction. 9. Asia. The next front. While Europe recovered, Asia was boiling. In 1949, China fell to communism under Mao Zedong. To many in Washington, this was proof that the Soviets were winning the global battle for influence. Soon after, the Korean Peninsula became a flashpoint where American and Soviet interests collided through proxy armies. The Cold War was no longer cold, it was heating up. 10. End of the beginning. By 1950, the lines were drawn. The United States led the Western Bloc, with NATO as its military shield and the dollar as its economic weapon. The Soviet Union commanded the Eastern Bloc, armed with the Warsaw Pact and a network of satellite states. Between them stood the world, forced to choose a side or risk destruction. What had begun as an alliance to defeat fascism had mutated into a new form of warfare, a war of ideologies, waged in labs, newspapers, and the human mind. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but the Cold War was just getting started, and the world was about to face a crisis so grave that one wrong word could end everything. In the flicker of a mushroom cloud, mankind saw its future and its possible end. The Cold War had begun not with a bang, but with a shadow. And as the world moved into the 1950s, that shadow was only growing darker.